Ralph Weir is a lecturer at the University of Lincoln and at the University of Oxford. He is a metaphysician working in the analytic tradition. Yeah, rozumiem is fine. He is interested in mind-body dualism especially. He recently published a book, The Mind-Body Problem and Metaphysics, which you can see some leaflets describing, also giving you, I think, a 20% discount if you want to buy it online. Somewhere at the front there or at the front here. I can't remember where I put them. So when you're exiting the room, please help yourself to a leaflet and do buy the book. He's quickly establishing his position as a preeminent expert in the field. He has authored the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on substance and co-authored with Howard Robinson the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on substance as well. He has published in journals such as the Review of Metaphysics, where previously Sartre, Heidegger, and John Paul II have published. And so Ralph Weir is a worthy follower in the footsteps of these giants. And if you Google his name, you will see countless videos of him expounding his fascinating doctrine that undermines everything that the 20th century stood for metaphysically. And we're going to have just a little sample of his extremely controversial but also irrefutable views presented here today. So please join me in giving Ralph a very, very warm welcome. And if you try to stay in the vicinity here, because that's the microphone that's picking up voice.
Okay. Dziękuję, Mikołaj. Witam Państwa. Nazywam się Stefan Weir i wykładam filozofię na Uniwersytecie w Lincoln i Uniwersytecie Oxfordzkim. I bardzo się cieszę, że jestem tutaj w Warszawie. To świetny uniwersytet. A teraz będę mówić po angielsku, bo mój polski nie jest taki dobry. This is not the first time I've had the pleasure of speaking at the University of Warsaw. In fact, I was here about maybe 5 years ago, 6 years pre-pandemic, giving a 3-hour lecture on Dostoevsky and philosophy in a room in this building somewhere nearby. I happened to fall rather ill that day, and there's nothing like giving a 3-hour lecture on Dostoevsky to challenge your fortitude when you're feeling unwell. Luckily, this time, I'm in a much better state. I've also worked closely with Mikołaj on a large project about science and religion in Central and Eastern Europe over the last 5 years or so, which has brought me to this country and other countries in the vicinity. As Mikołaj mentioned, I recently published a book, The Mind-Body Problem and Metaphysics, which was the outcome of my PhD research at the University of Cambridge, but also of a long process of thinking about what I regard as perhaps the central issue of modern philosophy. And what I'm going to do today is essentially summarize everything I think about this issue. Therefore, this is not going to be a high definition presentation of some focused, narrow argument, but rather an attempt to get across a big picture view of where contemporary philosophy of mind and perhaps philosophy more generally is at, in my opinion, and why, amongst other things, it's a very exciting time to be interested in big questions. Now, the foil for everything I'm going to say is a position known as materialism. Materialism is essentially the view that all of reality, everything that really exists, consists of the fundamental physical particles, fields, and forces investigated by natural science, in particular by physics. Materialism is a view that tends to be presupposed in contemporary Western intellectual culture, not only in philosophy, but much more broadly, of multiple competing traditions of thought that have kind of struggled for supremacy. At the moment, I think materialism is the most powerful. Materialism is also a view that I myself endorsed when I first started studying the kind of issues I'm going to talk about this evening. I was an adherent of the idea that science basically tells us about reality and tells us about all of reality, and that the higher level sciences, social science, psychology, and so on, are essentially reducible to physical science and ultimately to physics. This is a view that's kind of unusual in the history of ideas. In fact, for most of the history of philosophy, both in the West and around the globe, people have tended to reject a materialist picture of things. And in particular, they've endorsed an idea I'm going to focus on today, the idea that human persons, and perhaps other beings too, comprise not only material fields, forces, and particles, but also immaterial souls. And when I first studied the philosophy of mind about 15 years ago, I had the strange experience of, on the one hand, assuming materialism must be right, but on the other hand, being bewildered by how unsatisfactory, how implausible materialist explanations of human nature, especially the mental or spiritual side of human nature, seem to be, and how poorly motivated the official arguments in favor of materialism seem to be. So as a result of that, I ended up essentially spending the last 10, 15 years trying to get to the roots of this issue, beginning way back in ancient Greek and ancient Indian philosophy, all the way up to the latest logical, semantic, philosophical, and putatively scientific arguments put forward today. And I'm going to tell you about the kind of conclusions I've come to. If you Googled any of my stuff on this before, or if you've even heard the titles of some of my talks, it won't come as a surprise to know that I've ended up concluding that the materialist paradigm that dominates much of contemporary thought is in fact entirely lacking in rational motivation and results from an intertwined number of intellectual fashions which we should regard as, on the whole, very dubious. Moreover, I've come to the conclusion that the old idea of an immaterial soul or something like that deserves to be treated much more seriously than it ordinarily is. I would add that I think these questions about the nature of human persons, in particular, the nature of the mind, have acquired a kind of urgency of late that they didn't have before, due to recent advances in artificial intelligence technologies. 5 years ago, if you had said to me or to many experts in the field of artificial intelligence, we're soon going to have large language models with the capabilities of ChatGPT-4 or image generation programs with the capabilities of Stable Diffusion, I would have been skeptical, and so would many other people. As a result of the sudden advance we've seen, many tech enthusiasts predict that in the not too distant future, we are going to have artificial intelligence programs capable of simulating human level intelligence, and maybe pretty soon after that, greater than human level intelligence. Some of the leading voices in this area even suggest that once we do have human level or greater than human level AI, we'll have the opportunity to integrate our own nervous systems with artificial intelligence and ultimately to evade death by uploading our minds onto computers and surviving as digital replicas of ourselves. Well, whether that's at all plausible depends fundamentally on what we think about some very long-standing and, I think, ill-understood questions, philosophical questions about human nature and the philosophy of mind, thereby giving these questions a kind of urgency they haven't had until recently. Now, at the very core of the ideas I'm going to talk about is what's known as the mind-body problem. As I like to introduce it, the mind-body problem can be put as follows. On the one hand, you have physical or material properties like shape, weight, height, spatial location, just like a material object, like a rock. You also have some more complicated physical properties involving moving parts, things like cardiac circulation or respiration, like a more complex physical object, like perhaps a clock or a plant. But on the other hand, in addition to these physical, obviously physical properties involving essentially the location of physical parts and their interaction in space, you also have a unique first-person perspective onto the world, as it were a conscious interiority full of colors, sounds, sensations, thoughts, beliefs, desires, and so on. And the mind-body problem at its very broadest is simply the question, how is that the case? What's going on? Why is it that in some respects you're so like another physical object, and in other respects you're radically different? We usually assume a rock or a clock does not have its own perspective onto the world or its own conscious experiences. We usually don't think even a plant or a computer does. But what makes sense of that difference? I have a side interest in how to depict visually the situation we're in. In fact, on the last slide, one good way of thinking about the mind-body problem I take from Douglas Harding, who wrote a bunch of kind of bizarre but very thought-provoking books in this area. Harding says the way to think about this is other human beings are just like you insofar as they have legs and feet and a torso, arms, and so on. But in the case of other human beings, when you look at them, they've also got a head on top, which is, another physical part like any other. But from your own perspective, you're not like that. Above your torso, above your shoulders, instead of there being a head there, there's this space in which reality, the whole of reality from a certain perspective, seems somehow to enter. Harding talks about the realization on a hiking trip in his youth that he had no head, at least phenomenologically, and how this changed his perspective on the entire world. Well, I think the physicist Ernst Mach gets at the same idea in his rather well-known 1886 self-portrait. When other people do produce a self-portrait, right, they produce a picture of themselves roughly as they look in a mirror or in a photograph. Ernst Mach, being a smart guy, says, no, well, myself actually manifests itself in the world typically not like that, but like this, as a perspective onto the world that seems to be private to me and other people only know about, if at all, indirectly. But I think as they go, that's an extremely profound way of depicting visually the core issue that we face in the mind-body problem. Arguably, first-person shooter games like the classic 1993 Doom are profound in the same way, in that they depict visually this aspect of a person which we assume that ordinary physical objects just don't have. I mean, all right, the character in Doom doesn't really have a first-person perspective unless you're playing it. But that only shows how fundamentally mysterious this fact is. So that's the mind-body problem. Sometimes when people talk about the mind-body problem, they have something narrower in mind, like how do mind and body interact, or how do we explain conscious experience physically. My own opinion is the big problem is just how do we explain the fact that we have minds or mental or spiritual characteristics in addition to our bodies. We have this first-person perspective onto the world. And then there are these subordinate questions that arise once you've adopted a certain answer. The mind-body problem at its most fundamental is just the question, how is this the case? What's going on? And there's a traditional answer to the mind-body problem that can be found in more or less every human culture, globally and historically, which says, well, what's going on is that in addition to your physical body, which is indeed a complex physical mechanism, a bit like a rock or a clock or a plant or a computer, you also have an immaterial soul. Your body is the bearer of your physical properties, your soul is the bearer of your mental or spiritual properties, and perhaps when the two are integrated in the strangely intimate way they are, we can speak of an incarnate soul or an animated body. Nonetheless, these two components are distinct. Not only can you find examples of that idea in more or less every human culture that's ever existed that we know about, it also seems to be an idea that comes to us naturally as soon as we start thinking about ourselves, other people, and the world around us. The work of experimental developmental psychologists such as Paul Bloom and Jesse Bering has provided pretty persuasive evidence that something that looks a bit like soul-body dualism, as it's sometimes called, is implicit in the thinking of even very young infants prior to the influence of surrounding culture. And in most societies that have had this idea of some kind of immaterial component to human nature, soul or spirit or mind, this has not merely been a small addition to a worldview otherwise like our own, rather it has been part of a fairly radically different vision of reality on which the existence of this extra element points to a transcendent immaterial order to reality that goes beyond the minds of individual human persons, perhaps to God or to the Tao or something along those lines, and that makes persons endowed with these mental or spiritual properties a fundamental part of reality that can't be reduced to the kind of material complexes we study in physical science. I often, when I talk about this, I hit with the trouble of trying to provide a diagram illustrating the idea of the soul. Of course, because the soul's invisible, this is impossible to do, according to like traditional ideas. Here are a couple of options. I think, in fact, the thought bubble is perhaps one of the most profound visual depictions of human nature ever invented. It enters our visual language only in the late 19th, early 20th century in American comic strips, that should not let us overlook the deep profundity of this way of depicting ourselves that comes very naturally to us. On the right, I've got what it would be a more symbolic depiction of the idea of the soul, influenced by, well, various philosophical and religious traditions. The soul is like a non-bodily copy of you. It's depicted with wings because it's not weighed down by physical forces. For some purposes, that's a great way of depicting this idea, but I think it can mislead people into thinking we're actually talking about some slightly gaseous winged creature, which usually I think we are not. All right, so I've said more or less every culture, historically and globally, has this idea of an immaterial spirit or mind or soul. I should add one or two caveats. It is true that there have always been competing views of human nature. In particular, there was the Epicurean tradition in ancient Western thought, which said, in fact, you are just a composite of physical particles, physical atoms. There was also the Charvaka school in ancient Indian philosophy that said much the same thing. The Charvaka school isn't atomistic like Epicureanism is on the standard interpretations of it. There were other Indian atomistic schools as well. However, these alternative views were always very much in the minority until the modern world. And I think this is something very interesting. We live in the first society in the history of the world in which materialism about human beings is a presupposition shared in general by our intellectual culture. So how did that happen? How was the idea of the soul abandoned? Well, there's a long historical story one could tell here, drawing out different threads in Western thought. But at its very core are a few landmark theories that emerged in the 20th century. Even in 1949, Gilbert Ryle, in his very influential book, The Concept of Mind, was able to claim that the idea of a soul in addition, an immaterial soul in addition to the body, is accepted by most psychologists, philosophers, religious thinkers, and so on. It's the standard view, the official doctrine. That all changes in the middle of the 20th century. The first big change is the emergence of the view usually attributed to Ryle, known as behaviorism. Behaviorism is a theory of human psychology which, in its radical form, says, really, there is nothing more to our psychological states, our thoughts, feelings, desires, experiences, pains, pleasures, and so on, than physically observable behavior. To be in pain is to have a disposition to grimace or scream. To hold a belief is to have a disposition to respond to the surrounding world in a particular way. Behaviorism had a period of great popularity, but it was quickly supplanted when even those drawn to it, both to its radical scientific seeming nature and to its rejection of the idea of anything like an immaterial soul, felt it wasn't really satisfactory. Surely we can make sense of the idea of someone feeling pain without expressing it in their behavior at all. Surely there's such a thing as the internal state of pain or the internal state of believing something. For that reason, two further theories emerged. One is the mind-brain identity theory, which first appears in I think a 1958, maybe 1956 paper by a guy called U.T. Place, entitled, "Is Consciousness a Brain Process?" In that paper, Place says, look, conscious experiences, the sensation of pain, the experience of having a visual field filled with colors, that's not just behavioral. That's not just a matter of how your body moves about. Rather, that's a state in the brain. It is some process in your nervous system. When he says this, he doesn't just mean the brain processes cause or give rise to the experience of pain or of color perception. He means there is nothing more going on than the brain processes. Sometimes intellectuals can be a bit idiosyncratic, and U.T. Place actually had his brain preserved at the University of Adelaide where he worked. You can go and see it in a vat, and there's this sign that says, "Is this the mind of U.T. Place?" Well, that's how closely associated with him this theory is. There's also a slightly more subtle view known as functionalism. According to functionalism, it's not the case that some specific kind of brain state is inevitably identical to some particular kind of mental state. Rather, to have that mental state is for there to be some brain state which plays a particular function. For example, to be in pain is to have a brain state that takes physical damage, tissue damage as its input, and that yields screaming, grimacing, and that kind of thing as its output. Well, in recent philosophy, these positions have become very popular, and not only in philosophy. I won't go into the details of them any further now. However, I do want to add that it really isn't the case that the rise of materialism about human persons and hostility to the old idea of an immaterial soul is a peculiarly philosophical idea or something confined to academic philosophy. On the contrary, something I've discovered reading about this is that hostility to the idea of a soul is something prevalent throughout the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. It is one of the most distinctive and, in my opinion, most curious features of our intellectual culture. This extends even as far as Christian theologians. So here's a quotation from my friend Brandon Rickaber, who's a Christian philosopher over in the United States. Brandon says, "Here is a staggering truth. The ontology of the human person currently embraced by the most vocal Christian scholars working on this issue is a view that almost no Christians thought plausible only 100 years ago. Until recently, the dominant view among Christian thinkers has been various forms of mind-body dualism. The view that there's an immaterial soul or something like that, as well as the body. In stark disagreement, many contemporary Christian scholars vigorously advance anti-dualism and defend physicalism or materialism, the view that really there is only the material body." Well, that came as a real surprise to me when I discovered this. Before I knew Brandon, but it's absolutely true that this hostility to the idea of the soul isn't something confined to otherwise scientistic, anti-humanistic, or anti-religious thinkers, but actually extends throughout essentially all existing disciplines. And you might well ask yourself, well, how can it be the case that a Christian theologian would deny the existence of the soul, would argue that Christianity doesn't have the idea of the soul? Don't we all know that the Bible, the church fathers, the creeds, the medieval scholastic philosophers, the early modern Christian thinkers, and so on, don't we know that all of them are constantly talking about the soul until about 5 minutes ago? And the answer is yes, we do know that. In fact, there's a couple of good examples just from the Bible. I've written down the references here. For example, at Matthew 10:28, Jesus warns us against fearing those who can kill the body but can't kill the soul, but to fear only he who can kill both soul and body in Gehenna. At 2 Corinthians 5, 6-10, St. Paul says we would prefer to be away from the body. He seems to be talking about after death. We prefer to be away from the body and with the Lord rather than at home with the body and away from the Lord. We all must appear before the judgment seat of Christ and receive what is due for the things done while in the body. Now, it's been pointed out by a number of, in particular, quite recent scholarly works that you wouldn't talk about being away from the body, apotou sormatos in the original Greek, if you thought that you are just your body. You wouldn't talk about someone being able to kill the body and not the soul if you thought you are just your body. And therefore, it's quite hard to square the idea of materialism with these passages. Despite that, however, and I think this is really kind of telling of something about our culture, even those Christian theologians who recognize that from the Bible on, there's clearly this central belief in some immaterial components of humans that is independent of the body, even they go out of their way to play down this idea, to try and avoid describing this immaterial thing as the soul, or to try to blur the lines about what's really going on. The great English theologian N.T. Wright is a good example of that. Now, I don't think that's a tradition that can last. In fact, I think with Brandon Rickaber's work and the work of J.P. Morland and a few other scholars, it's now becoming recognized that you can't make out that traditional Christian theology from the Bible on is anything like contemporary materialism, let alone that it just denies the existence of an immaterial soul. Something interesting, however, is that this is not a unique occurrence in Christian scholarship. On the contrary, if you look at the scholarship of ancient Egyptian views on human nature, ancient Chinese views, traditional Jewish views, indigenous American views, again and again and again, you will find exactly the same pattern. A huge effort by scholars to contrast the broadly monistic or materialistic views of these cultures with the weird idea of a soul distinct from the body, which they represent as a modern idiosyncrasy, mainly due to someone like René Descartes. And in each of these cases, you find subsequent scholarly work showing just how tenuous, just how insupportable these interpretations are. So in the case of the ancient Chinese, Edward Slingerland, in the case of the Egyptians, Thomas McEvilley, and likewise again and again in other cases. I won't give you lots of examples here now. If you're interested, I gave a talk a year ago called In Defense of the Soul, which was videoed and can be found on YouTube. I give lots of examples of this. I think it's quite entertaining and really fascinating that there's this trend throughout these different scholarly traditions. The overall take-home point, though, is that the idea of an immaterial soul is treated by scholars like an embarrassing secret to be swept under the rug, whether because of a commitment to a religious tradition or a desire to represent some traditional culture in a positive light. Not only that, not only do scholars have a bizarre habit of playing down the historical prevalence of the idea of an immaterial soul, they also have a habit of doing down the idea of the soul, by which I mean claiming that it's an idea responsible for just about everything that's wrong with the world. Again, I won't go into the detail here, but I talk about this a little in the first chapter of the Routledge book, The Mind, Body, Problem, and Metaphysics, where I provide citations in which everything from the war on terror to the Belgian Congo to environmental destruction to sexism to racism and so on is blamed on the soul-body distinction. I have an example here, Val Plumwood's book, Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, in which Plumwood blames many of these evils on soul-body dualism. I don't have that example because Plumwood's a particularly egregious proponent of this view. Actually, like, her book is one of the best in which it's put forward, in the sense that it's rich and beautifully written, but it is also utterly unbelievable. The arguments put forward for the idea that it's the soul-body distinction responsible for these evils, well, it barely even emerges. So I find this really interesting. The first chapter of the Routledge book is entitled, "Why Does Everyone Hate the Soul?" And I think it's a fascinating fact about our culture that hasn't really been pointed out explicitly before, that everyone from Christian theologians to new atheists to postmodern sociologists to historians of culture and so on are unified in a loathing for the idea that there's an immaterial soul. This is a Greek term I've coined for this phenomenon, psychophobia, right? Fear of the soul. I think we live in a psychophobic age. Now, I don't know why this is, but I do think part of the explanation, part of it only, is that people have this impression that the idea of an immaterial soul is absolutely no good, that it's somehow been refuted, probably by modern science, and therefore they're hesitant to say anything good about it. But is that really true? By the way, I'm not keeping track of time. How are we doing? Just good. good without further detail. So there are two lines of argument that have been put forward over the last 100 or so years, scientifically, in my opinion, attempts to give scientifically respectable defenses of something approaching the traditional idea of the soul. One of these, I think, is not much good. The other, I think, is extremely compelling. The first is parapsychology. In 1882, a group of British scientists, philosophers, one future prime minister, Arthur Balfour, various other notable intellects, founded the Society for Psychical Research with the principal objective of looking for empirical scientific evidence for an immaterial soul. They did this both directly through investigating hauntings and indirectly through things like investigating extrasensory perception, near-death experiences, and other so-called paranormal phenomena. And it is worth saying that at first, and by that I mean for like the first 50 years, the Society's research obtained results, positive results that convinced a lot of very clever people. For example, in his most famous paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, the great computer scientist Alan Turing says, "I assume that the reader is familiar with the idea of extrasensory perception, right, perceiving things by some kind of psychic power without looking at them or hearing them or whatever. I assume the reader is familiar with this. These disturbing phenomena seem to deny all our usual scientific ideas. How we should like to discredit them. Unfortunately, the statistical evidence, at least for telepathy, is overwhelming." And Turing goes on to say, well, and it doesn't seem a big step from there to believing in ghosts. However, paranormal research of this sort to date has never achieved the kind of irrefutable evidence that it sought. One of the presidents of the Society, H.H. Price, once said, look, if we're going to give a convincing scientific case, we need to be able to produce these phenomena whenever we want. It's not enough just to find them sometimes. And so far as I can tell, that has never happened. for this reason, I am not personally inclined to put any weight on paranormal research in defending the old idea of an immaterial soul. I do feel bound to add in this context that I still have my own doubts about what to make of this research. Should we take any of it seriously or not? It's very, very hard to judge. I mean, it's certainly the case that some paranormal research has been shown to be fraudulent, has been debunked. On the other hand, that's also true of lots of ordinary scientific research, as the great philosopher Liam Coffey Bright says in his paper, "Why Do Scientists Lie?" Scientific culture involves lots of motivations that make it attractive to manipulate one's results. And we know that this happens not very infrequently. At the same time, at least some attempts to debunk paranormal research have themselves turned out to be fraudulent. So the very entertaining American magician and skeptic James Randi claimed to have replicated an investigation by the British paranormal researcher at the University of Cambridge, Rupert Sheldrake, about how dogs know that their owners are coming home 10 minutes in advance or whatever, with no apparent sensory evidence, and found that this research doesn't add up. But when he was asked to provide his results, provide evidence, Randy ended up having to admit he never really did this. He was just making things up. So, well, you know, how do we judge? I also find, I mean, what's certainly true is some people really do seem to have very strange experiences that they honestly can't explain themselves without appealing to some kind of supernatural occurrence. So occasionally people write to me about this kind of thing. Here's an email I received a few weeks ago by a guy called Michael Shaw. Michael, you know, in his email sounds like an extremely down-to-earth, he's a Canadian guy, martial arts instructor and various things. He really kept this to himself most of his life, but he's getting on a bit, and he thought he should share this with someone. Well, Michael thinks that he's lived in 2 houses which were haunted. And he knows this sounds crazy. He knows it, you know, it sounds ridiculous. He doesn't want to waste, you know, he says, I don't want to waste your time, but here is my experience, you know, do with it what you will. And I read through Michael's email. It goes on a lot longer than this. It's pretty creepy stuff. And I don't know what to do with it. I don't get the sense this is someone being dishonest or trying to get attention. He didn't ask me, please publicize this. I asked him, would you mind if I share it, if I give a talk on this? And he said, that's fine. So I had some perplexity regarding what to think about that kind of work. However, it is my opinion, and I don't think this has been recognized fully yet, but I believe and hope it will be, that the last 30 years or so of theoretical work on conscious experience really do provide what seem to be irrefutable arguments against materialism. And arguments that, if taken to their logical conclusion, which I mean quite literally, showing what actually logically follows from their premises, really do entail the existence of something that looks like an immaterial soul, however much their proponents would rather that not be the case. The most famous of these are known as the Mary argument, put forward by Frank Jackson and Howard Robinson in 1982, and the zombie argument put forward by David Chalmers in 1996, 2010, and a few new versions after that. I won't go into the details because there are a lot of details to go through, but I'll just summarize the easiest of these arguments to grasp. Frank Jackson asks us to imagine a scientist called Mary, who has lived all of her life in a black and white room. Her hair's dyed black and white. Somehow her tongue is bleached or whatever, I don't know. She's never seen color. But Mary learns through books about the science of color perception, perhaps through black and white TV shows about the science of color perception, she learns everything there is to know about the physics, chemistry, and biology of color perception in humans and other visually sentient animals. The question Jackson asks us is, would Mary be able to tell on that basis what it is like to see red? To put it another way, suppose she leaves her black and white room and for the first time she sees the blue sky, the red tomato, the green grass. Is it not reasonable to suppose she'd say, so that's what blue looks like. That's what it's like to see green. I've learned something new. Now, Jackson, and more or less everyone who's thought about this, there are official statistics on this among specialists. The majority of people who think about this are agreed that, yeah, Mary would learn something new. You could know everything there is to know about the physical science of color perception, but that wouldn't tell you what it is like from the inside, from your first-person perspective, to experience color. Well, if so, Jackson urges we must infer there is something extra there to know about. Something immaterial, something beyond the world as described by physical science. Various other arguments have been put forward that push in the same direction, in my opinion, very forcefully indeed. There's a similar argument that gets a little less attention, but I think might be of even greater importance, which points out that no physical or psychological description of a human being, however detailed, will logically entail that that being is you. To put that another way, we can make perfectly good sense out of the idea of a perfect physical and psychological duplicate of you, a kind of identical twin with the same memories, the same history, and so on. And despite their physical and psychological similarity, they would be another person. You would still be there looking out of your eyes. You'd have no confusion, no doubt at all about which one you were, because they'd be over there in your visual field and you'd still be over here. Well, proponents of this second argument on very similar grounds urge that if so, we've got to accept there is something extra in addition to the physical and other psychological facts present here. There is the fact of something's being you, or there is the unique subject of your perspective onto the world, the person you are, as opposed to a person merely like you in every other way. That's an interesting argument because it entails not only are the conscious experiences immaterial, but the subjective experience is immaterial as well. Now, I've said I don't think the full force of those arguments has been recognized. The reason for that is that in order to set them out in all of their detail, it is necessary to make use of a lot of rather complex semantic or cognitive psychological apparatus. The two approaches are known as two-dimensional semantics, or the transparency theory of phenomenal concepts, the former associated with David Chalmers, Australian philosopher, the latter with the British and Swiss philosophers Philip Goff and Martina Niederrümelin. We can't go into the detail about those now. However, I think there's a way we can skip over all that detail and get a good idea of how powerful these arguments are by thinking about the materialist responses. And materialists, some people would say I'm oversimplifying, but I don't believe I am. Materialists essentially have two responses. On the one hand, some materialists say, well, look, the reason why we can't explain your conscious experiences or your unique personal identity in physical terms in such a way that Mary could just see that someone with those physical properties has to have that conscious experience and has to be you rather than someone else. The reason we can't do that is because actually conscious experience and unique subjects of experience don't exist. When they're talking about conscious experience, materialists of this kind tend to say consciousness is a kind of illusion or a persistent theoretical error. All that really exists are certain physical processes, but somehow we're fooled into thinking there's something extra. When they're talking about personal identity, materialists tend to say all there really are certain patterns of physical and psychological resemblance. There's no deep sense in which you now are the same person as you yesterday. It's just that the person sitting there now has some similar memories to the person who was around yesterday, has some similar physical and psychological traits, which were caused by the traits of the person who was around yesterday. That's one option. Say it doesn't really exist. The second option, and this is actually, I think, more popular, although it's philosophy, people sometimes blur the boundary between the two unhelpfully. The other view says, no, these phenomena do exist. There is a deep sense in which you are a unique subject of experience who survives over time. You really are undergoing this technicolor phenomenology of conscious experience. And all of this really is material, but we have absolutely no idea how. That view is put across quite explicitly by Colin McGinn in his 1989 article, Can We Solve the Mind-Body Problem? It's also implicit in the phenomenal concept strategy of David Papineau, for example, where the whole project is not to give an explanation of so that we can see why some physical system must be conscious, but rather to reconcile us to the fact that we can't see why it must be conscious. Now, I think both of those are extremely unsatisfactory. With regard to conscious experience, I mean, of course you are undergoing conscious experience. If there's one thing you know for sure, surely you know that. Here you are. It's like something to be you now. You can hear my voice. You're feeling a, panoply of pleasure and admiration as you listen to my talk. Undeniable facts about reality. With regard to personal identity, I think the best way to see why we can't deny the reality of this can be illustrated by a short thought experiment, as they're known, put forward by the philosopher Roderick Chisholm. So the materialist wants to say, or the person denying there's any deep fact about whether you're you, wants to say, no, all there are conventions, linguistic conventions, according to which we say you're the same person because you're psychologically and physically similar from day to day. You know, the infant, the illiterate infant you were 20 or 40 years ago, and the elderly wise person you'll be in 20 or 40 years, yeah, they're you just in the sense that they're connected to you in various ways, and we conventionally say it's the same person. Well, Roderick Chisholm says, look, suppose I'm about to undergo an operation, serious operation, and I can get it expensively with anesthetic or very cheaply without anesthetic. In the first case, there will be no pain. In the second case, there will be lots of excruciating pain. So option one looks kind of more attractive despite the financial cost. But suppose a group of philosophers and psychiatrists and other intellectuals, your friends, your family, gather and say, don't worry, go for the cheap option, and we will simply declare a linguistic convention according to which the person undergoing the operation isn't really you while you're undergoing it. It's someone else. Well, Chisholm says, obviously, that should not affect my decision, right? Obviously, there's a fact that is not dependent on our linguistic conventions about who is who. And if that fact can't be captured in the ontology of physical science, so much the worse for materialism. Now, an increasing number of very brilliant theorists have accepted that materialism is flawed in the way I've described. Here are some books where this happens. Interestingly, to me at least, even these thinkers, David Chalmers, Jai Guan-Kin, Philip Goff, and others, resist any return to the old idea of an immaterial soul. They scrape about for other alternatives. Chalmers talks about, well, maybe there are non-physical properties that belong to the physical body. Philip Goff endorses panpsychism, according to which actually fundamental particles or cosmic fields are already conscious, and we're sort of a mixture of that cosmic consciousness. Even some of our colleagues at the University of Freiburg, who have been kindly running a seminar on my book, and who actually all agree that there is this immaterial subject, they're, in my opinion, right at the forefront of the current movement, have raised concerns about applying the word soul to it, because this comes with some baggage they're worried about, they want to avoid. Well, for a number of reasons, I don't think this is really tenable. I think, in fact, if you follow through on these arguments, what you end up with is an apparently non-physical or immaterial center of a person's identity and mental or spiritual life that does not seem to be logically dependent on their physical existence. Of course, it's very intimately related to it. Well, that just looks a lot like the traditional idea of the soul. And if we're going to be intellectually honest, we should call a spade and say, yeah, that old idea of the soul looks better than we were saying it looked until recently, right? There's no point in trying to fumble the terminology to avoid that conclusion. Well, there are some more details there, but to jump to my final topic, what many people are inclined to say is, well, hang on a moment, though, even if these arguments seem quite persuasive, don't we know that there can't be such a thing as an immaterial soul? Hasn't science shown that? Even some of these guys give us their reason for resisting the full-blown old idea of a soul-body distinction, the thought that science has somehow proved this untenable. Now, in fact, there really is only one influential, putatively scientific argument in the literature against the kind of view I'm defending. This is known as the causal closure argument. And although it can be put in a few different ways, the argument goes like this. It says, well, look, we know that every physical action, every physical movement performed by a human organism results from a chain of sufficient physical causes that force that action to occur, right? We can look at these at the biological level or the chemical level or the physical level, but we know there's a chain of causes that make you do everything you ever do. Secondly, therefore, if there were an immaterial mind or soul, anything like that, it would not be able to make any difference to anything your body ever does. It couldn't be responsible for your voluntary behavior when you reach for the glass because you're thirsty, or where you tell someone, I'm deeply and overwhelmingly in love with you because you love them, or anything like that. All of your behavior would already be determined by purely physical causes. Furthermore, however, if there really were an immaterial soul or mind or whatever, of course it would have to make a difference to your physical behavior. It would be crazy to suppose that there's this inner center of conscious experience, of belief, desire, pain, terror, etc., thought, belief, intentions, but it's not actually causing your body to do any of the things it does. That would look really weird. Therefore, there is no immaterial mind or soul. That's how the argument goes. You can put it in one or two other ways, but that's a pretty accurate representation. Now, there are a few things to say about this argument. This is a very, very widely endorsed argument. It's doing a hell of a lot of heavy lifting in current philosophy of mind, in being really the only argument that is bearing the weight of the materialist paradigm, along with its extremely implausible, otherwise, attempts to account for conscious experience, the unique subject of those experiences, and various other phenomena too, which I haven't talked about tonight. The whole weight of the materialist paradigm throughout our intellectual culture is sitting atop this argument. And yet, first of all, this argument is no more effective against the old idea of an immaterial soul than it is against the kind of newfangled anti-materialist views of people like Chalmers, Kim, and Goff. That's something I've argued in detail in some of my publications, but it doesn't really need to be argued because they tend to accept this. They actually say this in their work. Crazily, they say we can't believe in the soul because of the causal closure argument, but then they say, oh yeah, the causal closure argument must go wrong somewhere because it also refutes my view. More importantly, however, this argument depends on an empirical premise, which is just, so far as I can tell, not at all supported by empirical evidence. So when people inclined to the kind of view I'm defending talk about this argument, they tend to go for a premise 2 or premise 3. They tend to say, well, maybe the mind could just be an epiphenomenon that never affects the body. Or maybe we could have everything brought about by physical causes and mental causes simultaneously somehow. The sadly deceased E.J. Lowe argues in that way. Well, I think that's fine. There are some really ingenious pieces of work that approach the argument like that. But I think they absolutely overlook that we certainly shouldn't accept the first premise of this argument on faith or as a matter of dogma. We need to know, well, how do we know that everything that ever happens in your body is caused by a chain of sufficient physical causes? What's the case in favor of that? If there's a good case, of course, we have to accept it. We shouldn't accept it without evidence. And the curious thing is, when you see people present this argument, good evidence is never given. Two kinds of evidence are sometimes offered. The first comes from physics. The first says, well, look, physics gives us 4 fundamental forces: strong and weak nuclear force, electromagnetic force, gravitational force. And our investigations that have given us the standard theory, an immensely powerful theory of physical reality, haven't picked up on any other forces. Indeed, the physical system described by the standard theory has these symmetry relations, so that if you had a closed physical system describable as such, you really couldn't have any other force acting within it. Therefore, there are no other forces acting in the human organism. Now, the problem with that line of reasoning is that, sure, the physical theory we've built up by investigating the behavior of inanimate matter in the kind of highly controlled conditions that exist, for example, at the Large Hadron Collider, doesn't reveal any further forces acting and can describe a hell of a lot without needing any other forces. But it would simply be question begging to infer, to generalize from that case to the case of animate organisms, because of course, people like me who think there might be an immaterial mind or soul don't think that there are immaterial minds or souls pushing particles about at the Large Hadron Collider. What we need is evidence about the relevant physical scenario, not a generalization from an obviously irrelevant scenario, right? I can't prove that there are no chairs in this room by investigating the room next door and showing there are no chairs there. That's obviously not going to work. And in fact, there's an excellent work by my colleague, Brian Pitts, who's trained in physics as well as in philosophy, describing in detail how a physical system might be able to be influenced by an immaterial force under conditions that just diverge from the standard theory as it operates in inanimate matter. So what we should ask for is, look, what about animate organisms? How do we know that in that case, everything that happens entirely because of chains of sufficient physical causes. Now, sometimes it is claimed that we do know that. David Papineau, the most influential proponent of the causal closure argument, has asserted that. But unlike with other scientific claims, where it's possible to gesture at specific experimental or observational evidence, Papineau never supplies any such thing. Instead, what he says is, well, look, we've had neuroscience for a while, but neuroscientists have not discovered that there are non-physical causes operating in the nervous system. And so we shouldn't believe in any. Now, my opinion is, and I'm pretty confident in this, that is a spurious line of reasoning. People sometimes say absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. That's a little too simple to deal with this, but it's a broadly applicable claim. The crucial thing is absence of evidence, the failure to discover non-physical causes operating in the nervous system is only evidence against their existence to the degree that we rationally believe that if they were present, we would have observed them. That's the crucial thing. And this is well known by scientists, statisticians, philosophers of science who apply mathematical reasoning to evidential force. You have to show that there's a high probability we would have observed this if it were there before you can take its non-observation as evidence for its absence. Papineau never makes the slightest effort in any of the works I've read by him supporting this argument, and there are more than one, to do that. And in fact, there's a very good prima facie case for thinking if there were non-physical forces operating in the nervous system, brain scientists certainly would not have observed them. Why is that? Well, the nervous system is an extremely complex, warm, wet, and noisy system involving countless billions of particles interacting in incredibly complex ways, such that to build an accurate model of what's going on mechanically and recognize divergences from what you'd expect on the basis of physical laws is just far beyond what we're capable of now. And there is good reason to think, and many biologists have argued more or less directly for this, far beyond what we could ever expect to do. If you thought that any non-physical force would have to be really, really strong, then you could get around this. Suppose Papineau said, well, look, if there is a soul action in the body, every time it influences the nervous system, it's going to destroy 10% of your neurons. Then we'd notice if that were happening, right? But there's no reason to think anything like that. In fact, there are even neo-Aristotelian biological theories that don't appeal to an immaterial soul, but that still posit that the mechanics of the nervous system is not what you would expect on the basis of physical laws alone. And the reason they haven't been refuted is because we're not in a position to test that experimentally, or at least we certainly don't seem to be. And the people who insist on this first premise do not go to any effort to show that we are. So I think we should be bold and call the bluff of an argument that claims to have evidence but doesn't present it. I think one good way to think about this, and I'm wrapping up now, is as follows. Suppose we were to get all of the world's best scientists together in a room and to allow them to ask them to use the most advanced measures we have to map out what's going on mechanically in a person's nervous system, you know, electrodes, encephalography, and so on, fMRI, and then to predict what that person will do in the next 5 minutes or 15 minutes on the basis of physical laws. If they did that, and they were able to predict what this person did with 100% accuracy, that would give us very, very good evidence that there are no non-physical forces operating, there are no departures in animate organisms from the mechanics of inanimate matter. But the reason this study has never been carried out is that we already know that the predictions would be abysmally bad. We are not able to predict people's behavior on the basis of physical laws. And it seems to me that without such predictions and without some substitute for them by the proponents of these arguments, we really shouldn't take such arguments seriously. It's worth adding one last thing on that point. It's not a new idea that everything that happens in a physical organism follows from deterministic physical laws. It's a really old idea. It's older than Socrates. The pre-Socratic atomists seem to have thought this, and Epicurus raised some questions about it. It appears famously in the 1800s in Pierre-Simon Laplace, in the example of Laplace's demon. This is an idea people have been putting forward for a long time. So we shouldn't accept just the ideas kicking about as grounds to think we have good evidence for it. We need to know what's changed about the evidential system. Certainly Democritus's arguments don't work. Do we have a new argument that works? And actually, things get even worse, it seems to me, when you note that our fundamental physics, quantum mechanics, is based on observations consistent with indeterminism in physics, with things happening that were not brought about by chains of sufficient causes, but that involve a certain degree of randomness. David Papineau mentions this in one footnote and just dismisses it. Well, okay, the probabilities are predetermined. But hang on a moment, you think, well, if there's indeterminism at the macroscopic level of the nervous system, then that's going to make it even harder to detect any distinct forces operating there, and make it even less plausible that we would have noticed them on the basis of existing brain science, which just doesn't operate in that kind of full detail, high resolution, physical mechanistic manner. It used to get said, well, maybe this won't matter because quantum effects couldn't exist in warm, wet, noisy systems like the nervous system. That view's since been challenged over just the last few years with the observation, apparently, of evidence for quantum effects in plant photosynthesis, bird navigation, and so on. Again, I'd really like to hear what proponents of the causal closure argument have to say about that actual empirical evidence based on existing experiments you can cite. However, I've said a lot, and to conclude, I'd just like to say, so where do we end up? Well, look, it seems to me the last 50 to 70 years have exhibited an extraordinary intellectual revolt against the idea of the soul and in favor of materialism that's prevalent throughout the sciences, social sciences, and the humanities, and that is widely perceived as being somehow based on new scientific insights. And yet, when you investigate this idea, it turns out to be based on no persuasive evidence or arguments at all. On the contrary, there seem to be extremely compelling arguments against it. Do I think, therefore, once the news gets out and people have read my book, we're going to give up on this idea? Well, I'm not sure if we will, because it seems to me that the evidence and arguments are so bad that there must be something else driving people to be suspicious of or hostile to the idea of the soul. Psychophobia must have some other origin which might remain influential, even though it really shouldn't be. If we are being intellectually honest, however, and we don't have good responses to these concerns, I think we really need to take the idea of the soul or something like it much more seriously than intellectuals tend to have done for a long time. And I don't see that as wholly bad news. A vision of the world in which the personal, unique subjective experience and their conscious states, volitions, and so on are fundamental is a vision on which the human world of our personal relationships, beliefs, tragedies, betrayals, and so on, is the real world. It's a vision on which the world of literature and history is no less real than the world of physics. And I suspect that's a view on which we're likely to get maybe more consolation, more inspiration than the kind of materialist views that have dominated for the best part of the last century. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Rob, for riveting talk, enjoyable and insightful as always. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. I know that there are some questions online which I'll moderate, and I see there are also questions in the room. Before I figure out how this will work, I start questions in the room. Helen, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Weir, for a very interesting talk. It's an area I know about very, very generally. So my question has to do with your helping increase my own knowledge. One basic question that I've always wondered about is there a distinction between first person consciousness, personal identity, and subjectivity?
No.
That's my first question. My second question is, one area you didn't talk much about at all, maybe it probably just doesn't belong to analytic philosophy, but psychology, and I'm thinking about Lacan in particular, where if subjectivity is the same as first person consciousness, I mean, in Lacan, based on Freud, with subjectivity arising in trauma, everyone's subjectivity. Is that an argument for materialism, or is that an argument? How does that fit in with this? Since you, I don't know, I'm hoping you do the thinking.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a few important points. So whether we distinguish between subjectivity and first-person consciousness is not going to be determined by the way those technical terms are actually used in the theoretical literature. People aren't consistent about this. Many theorists just use the phrase subjectivity and first-person consciousness to refer to the idea that there's something it's like to be that thing. As Thomas Nagel famously said in his 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? We have this idea I know there's something it's like to be me from the inside. I believe there's something it's like to be a bat. Maybe there's something it's like to be an earthworm, though probably not very rich. Some people would just say that is first-person consciousness. It has its own first-person perspective, however simple. It is conscious of some experiential states, and subjectivity means the same thing. On the other hand, sometimes when people talk about subjectivity, they mean something rather more. They might mean the idea that there are subjective statements which can't be settled on the basis of interpersonal observation. Maybe the statement that Beethoven's better than Bach is subjective. We can probably put that to one side. They might have in mind what people sometimes call self-consciousness, a subject coming to be aware of itself as a subject.
Self-consciousness, first person.
Yeah. Well, so at least many theorists think you might be conscious without being self-conscious. You might be undergoing some sensations without it coming to your realization that you are a thing undergoing sensations. This gets debated a bit, but I guess I'm sympathetic to that idea. Like, I don't know if I am always aware of myself as a subject. Some of the time, there's the overwhelming pain of the headache, or there's the pleasure of the situation, but at least you're not in any current, present cognitive state reflecting on, and this is happening to me now, thinking about yourself under the first person personal pronoun. I think it's for that reason that in Roger Scruton's work on human nature, he takes the view that there are basic intentional states. I'm having this conscious intentional state about the room or whatever that we might share with pretty simple organisms. and certainly some simpler organisms than we are. But there are also these much more important intentional states that involve either attributing intentional states to myself as a subject, here I am reflecting on things, or attributing intentional states to you as another subject. And I think, although Lacan isn't a direct inspiration for Scruton on this, I think they're both downstream of an idea that subjectivity of that higher kind does arise, maybe through trauma, maybe through the struggle we have interacting with other subjects. You asked if this is the same thing as personal identity. Again, I think at least some would definitely want to distinguish them. Galen Strawson argues that consciousness must be non-physical in the ordinary sense of physical, but he thinks there really is no such thing as the conscious subject that persists over time. He thinks that Galen Strawson yesterday was not in any deep sense the same as Galen Strawson today. There's just this succession of experiences. He should be very grateful, therefore, to all these past Galen Strawsons who have got him this cushy professorship and this rather pleasant life. You wonder why they did that. Yeah, so some people would want to say they're different, at least conceptually, and maybe can even come apart. I don't think they can come apart, but I think the concepts are different. Does the idea that subjectivity arises through trauma or something like that count against physicalism? I don't think so. I'd say it's a tangential issue. We don't really know why subjectivity arises, but any process that a physicalist could appeal to, when organisms interact in this way physically, that's when it happens. An anti-physicalist could argue, well, that might be the scenario in which this is caused to occur, but that what is caused to come into existence is still something extra, as various arguments seem to show.
Let's move on to the second question, which is from one of our online participants, Thomas Stewin, from the philosophy faculty here. Donald, if you try to use the microphone.
Yes, do you hear me? Do you hear me now? Yes, great. Okay, thank you very much for your immensely interesting lecture. I must say I completely agree with many of the claims you've made, especially with what you said about this first premise in the causal closure argument. Sorry for not showing my face, but my camera is broken, so I cannot do anything about it. My question would be, well, first a little comment. I would say this general movement against materialism is maybe even more popular than you say. We have, for example, this book, Defense of Dualism by Howard Robinson. There is this volume, The Waning of Materialism. I don't remember the editors now, but I can send the links if anyone is interested in the chat. So I think it's an important philosophical phenomenon now, and I completely agree that materialism should be more vehemently opposed, as you say. Now, my question would be: you spoke about the immaterial soul. So my question would be: what comes into the concept of soul, as you understand it, apart from being immaterial? Because we can say, for example, dispositions or potentialities are also immaterial. And you reject the dispositional idea of the mind by Ryle. I come from a perspective of history of philosophy, so Aristotle is often interpreted in this way that the soul is a set of capacities. So, and some people have compared this, of course, to functionalism, yes, as Putnam has done, or Martha Nussbaum. So my question would be, what comes into the idea of soul, as you understand it, apart from being immaterial? Because this seems to me too weak to differentiate your position from, I would say, a kind of non-reductive materialism. Yes?
That's a really great point to touch on. So just to repeat, because the mic's not, the audio is not so loud. So the first point was that, Tomasz suggests that the movement against materialism, I mentioned towards the end, Chalmers, Goff, Kim, etc., is perhaps stronger than I gave it credit for. He mentions a book by George Beeler and someone else I forget called The Waning of Materialism that came out about 10 years ago, arguing that actually a majority of people in the area have now given up on materialism. Also mentioned a book by Howard Robinson, Arguments Against Materialism, I think it's called. There's another one by Benedict Paul Gurker, a collection of essays called After Physicalism. On that point, I just want to agree that, yeah, I think, you know, insofar as it would ever looks like the tide's turning in an intellectual culture, that's what it looks like now. This is partly to do with people changing their minds. It's partly to do with new people coming into the discipline and old people dying. You know, it's sometimes said that science progresses one funeral at a time. So you get a different set of views being adopted. The second point Thomas made, much more technical point, was what makes something count as a soul apart from merely being immaterial? And he gave the example of a dispositional theory of the mind, according to which to have a mind is to have certain dispositions to behave in certain ways, Gilbert Ryle endorses this theory. Well, dispositions seem to be immaterial, and therefore that looks like you've got an immaterial mind, but that doesn't seem like enough. Some people think Aristotle's theory was a bit like that, and they think Aristotle didn't have an immaterial mind or soul either. This gets a little complex. I guess my answer would be, first of all, it seems to me that for a disposition to be concretely instantiated, you do in fact only need physical objects and events and some theory of physical causation. So you could have a Humean, Lewisian view of causation on which causal laws just describe regularities in the physical world, and you'd have a really pure physicalist view, or you could have a laws or powers view of causation on which you know, an electron is defined in terms of its power to interact with a positron in such and such a way, and so on. Either view is going to get you dispositions out of a fairly standard physicalist ontology. So I certainly wouldn't say, I guess I'm not inclined to say that if we just say by a soul we mean an immaterial mind, we end up saying a dispositionalist has a theory of the soul. You also mentioned Aristotle. It's true Aristotle uses the term translated soul, psyche, for the form of the body on the hylomorphic theory, though he also has one aspect of the soul, it seems, on popular interpretation, the nous, the intellect, which is very clear is immaterial and seems to be able to exist without the soul, at least that, without the body rather. That's what all traditional interpreters of Aristotle thought. In the ancient world, it's the view taken up by medieval Aristotelians. I think personally the attempt to represent Aristotle as a kind of functionalist or materialist is really just another example of psychophobia, the attempt to play down the prevalence of the old idea of an immaterial soul. That still doesn't answer, well, what is it that makes something, you know, justifiably called the soul? I suppose my take is, it seems to me really clear that there's this shared core view among historical theories in philosophy, both Western and Eastern philosophy, not just like Platonism, but also the main schools of Hindu philosophy, Vaisheshika, Nyaya, Mimamsa, Samkhya, and so on, or some unorthodox schools, Jainism, and also shared among traditional cultures and young infants, that just says there's something incorporeal in addition to the body that accounts for our mental faculties. I want to say, you know, it's so normal to use the word soul for that thing in other contexts when we're not doing philosophy. Anything that looks a bit like that, we're going to have to admit, by embracing the existence of such a thing, we're embracing something that to a significant degree deserves to be called an immaterial soul. But I don't think we should get hung up on language It's a reasonable word for it, but the important thing is what is that, not what do we call it, I suppose.
All right.
Thank you very much.
You've gone on for too long in your responses. Well, and there's only time to look for these two questions, although there are many more. I have at least three. But whoever's interested in discussing further, we're probably going to go on, at least with those of you present non-virtually. That is a great benefit of being present non-virtually, and a great downside of being present only virtually. But before I'd like to just say that there's the World Day of Philosophy tomorrow. And the Faculty of Philosophy is organising a lot of very interesting events to celebrate that day, and to which you are all welcome. I had a picture somewhere promoting this, but unless Michael shares it immediately on the chat, I won't be able to present it. So, Martin, if you could. I'm going to do it, and in the time that Martin figures out how to send the photo, please join me in giving our speaker today, Ralph Weir, a round of applause for a fascinating talk and an excellent Q&A.